Right. Hi, grade 11s. I'm going to try to cover some work with you based on videos of your notes. You would have already have received these notes in class, and then obviously we've sent them out again. So you do have them, but in the following set of themes that we will be doing, I will also send the PDFs of the notes to you. So just to finish off the section on plant diversity, you will remember we've done bryophytes, we've done pteridophytes, we've done gymnosperms. You will remember, or you should remember, that gymnosperms were part of a group called spermatophytes. And spermatophytes are seed-bearing plants. Now, gymnosperms had what we call naked seeds, seeds that are not covered, whereas angiosperms, their seeds have a covering. If you think of a peach, for example, you eat the flesh, and once you've eaten around the flesh, you get to the seed on the inside. That is a covered seed, and therefore angiosperms produce seeds, covered seeds like fruits or flowers. So angiosperms are divided into two groups, either monocotyledons or dicotyledons. Now, if you don't know what a cotyledon is, the best way that I can try to explain it is that a cotyledon is a seed leaf as such. If you think of millies, if you're going to make popcorn, that little yellow seed, it's one little seed. If you try to take the outer covering off, you're still only going to find one little seed, one seed leaf inside that millie. Whereas if you take a bean, if you took a bean seed and you took the outer covering off, you would find two seed leaves attached to each other, and therefore we say it has two cotyledons, so it is dicotyledonous. Monocotyledonous plants and dicotyledonous plants have different structures. Just bear with me, trying to figure this stuff out. Hello. And this is why we teach face-to-face. Okay. So monocots and dicots have different characteristics, of which they are laid out on the screen. Now, as I've said, monocotyledons have one cotyledon and dicotyledons have two cotyledons. If you look at the leaves of a monocotyledonous plant, monocotyledonous leaves have what is called parallel veins. In other words, the veins run parallel to each other. If you think of that long maize leaf, all the veins run parallel to each other. We don't see any branches in that leaf. A dicotyledonous leaf has one net vein, one main vein in the middle, from which others branch off of, which is called net venation. Then I want you to think back about grade 10 and secondary thickening, and how you learned that bark develops during secondary thickening. In other words, a plant, the stem will become thicker and thicker and thicker and eventually be surrounded with a layer of bark. That only happens in dicotyledonous plants. Monocotyledonous plants have no secondary thickening. Also, again, a reminder of grade 10. If you can remember, you guys drew pretty pictures of a cross-section through a dicotyledonous root, stem, and leaf. And when you did that, when you drew the stem, you sort of drew a circle, obviously as the outer stem, and on the inside, you drew what looked like those little Halloween candies, the yellow, orange, and white little sweets, in a circle. And those what I call Halloween candies are called vascular bundles. And so you found that the vascular bundles of a dicotyledonous stem are found in a ring. In a monocotyledonous plant, those vascular bundles are just scattered wherever they want to be. They're not in a specific pattern or in a ring. They're just found throughout the tissue. The last characteristic, and maybe one of the most important ones in noticing if we give you a diagram of a plant is the flower whorls. Now, when I talk about the flower whorls, that's a fancy name for saying the parts. So leaves are a flower whorl. Petals are a flower whorl. Sepals or sepals, however you prefer to say it, are a flower whorl. When we talk about those whorls, we say they come in sets of whatever, multiples of whatever. That means if the multiple is 3, there could be 3, 6, 9, 12, 50, 300. Okay, and so monocotyledonous plants have their flower whorls in sets of 3. That could mean a specific flower, let's say, might have 6 petals, but only 3 sepals, and only 3 leaves, for example. Or it could have 9 petals and 6 leaves and 3 sepals. It doesn't matter as long as it's in multiples of 3. So you will always notice their flower whorls in diagrams, and we like to ask that. A dicotyledonous plant will always have its flower whorls in multiples of 4 or 5. So it could be 4, 8, 12, 16, 40, 400, or 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, 500. Okay. Either way, it's 4 or 5, and the difference being 3 in monocotyledons. So then we move on to the structure of a flower. And hint, hint, nudge, nudge, we love grade 11s to ask this diagram. Not to draw, but to label or to answer some questions based on some labels. So it's an important one to study, and it's also nice. It's a nice question rather than some difficult question about alternation of generations. So a flower has main flower parts that we always look at or that we look for. So for example, it has petals, and it has sepals, and it has a pedicel, and it has a receptacle. Okay, now just quickly, the pedicel is like the little stem of the flower. The receptacle is the part where the stem meets the ovary. The sepal or the sepal are the little leaves. So if you think of like a tomato, in the little hole where the tomato is, that part you cut off when you eat the tomato, sometimes if you've picked a fresh tomato, you'll find tiny little leaves there. Those are sepals, not the leaves that you see, the big leaves of the plant. Okay, the leaves of the actual flower are the sepals. And then I think I've done everything. Pedicel, sepal, receptacle, and obviously then the petals, the pretty parts that are colorful and attract the pollinators. Then every plant has male and female or female parts. Okay, so I'll get to that a little bit later. But basically, we can talk about male parts, just like we talk about in humans, and female parts. Right. So if I refer to the male parts, another word for male part is androecium. Okay, so if I say, what is another name for the male part of a plant, then I'm looking for the word androecium. Okay, so androecium means male and gynoecium means female. The androecium consists of 2 things, 2 structures that are collectively known as the stamen. So in other words, the stamen is the androecium. Okay, just in English, the stamen is the male part of the plant. Stamen is the androecium. The stamen is made up of 2 structures, the anther and the filament. Okay, now that is the little stick and balls, right? Take your mind out of the gutter, but that is how I describe it. It's a little thin little filament, a stick, with a ball coming off of it. That anther is the sticky part, the part you always find like some yellow stuff on it. That's pollen attached to the little stick, which is the filament. And the collective name for that is a stamen. And the stamen is the androecium. Right. Then the gynoecium, the female part, is made up of 3 structures. The ovary with ovules inside of the ovary, and the style and the stigma. Now, You can try and remember it as sticky stigma. The sticky stigma is the part that is, it is sticky. That's why I'm calling it that, not because I think I'm funny. It's the part to which the pollen will attach when pollination occurs. The stigma is attached to the style, which is a tube that runs down all the way through to the ovary, which contains the ovules. So the stigma, the style, and the ovary together are the gynoecium, the female parts. There is a collective name as well, and it's not on this note, so please just make a note of it. It is called the carpel. So the same as the stamen is the name for anther and filament, carpel is the collective name for stigma, style, and ovary, and that's CARPEL, carpel. All right, this next diagram shows you just another way of looking at it, and there you can see my stick and balls that I was speaking about, my anther and filament. You can see the ovule, you can see the stigma, you can see the style. When we ask it, if we were going to ask this diagram now, and how many petals there were, we would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But it would be a difficult question because this plant is actually in cross-section. We have to take cognizance of the fact that we have done a cross-section of this flower for you to be able to see the inside of the ovary. Okay, so we've cut away some of the petals. So your diagram would have to be very clear for us to ask it that way. But take note, if we give you a complete flower and we have shown you the cutaway, we can ask you how many petals the flower or which type of plant the flower may be. Hint, hint as well is if you were to be asked this, okay, I know you're not having a practical exam this year, but if I gave you a flower with its leaves, there are two ways to really know if it's a monocotyledon or a dicotyledon. The first way is to look at the flower whorls. But you know what you guys like to do, because you're a bunch of assholes, is you like to pull off one of the petals or one of the sepals so that your friends can't see how many. So another way, and again, you don't have a practical exam, but it doesn't matter. I can ask it in a test if I like. Another way is to look at the leaves and the venation. Okay, so if we look at the flowers that we've just looked at, we need to assign some terms to those flowers. So let's start at the flower that we've just done. We know that flower had an androecium and a gynoecium. In other words, it had male parts and female parts. A plant that has both its male parts and female parts on the same plant is called a monoecious flower or a monoecious plant. All right, so the ones that we've just done were monoecious. But some plants, we find only the male parts on one plant and only the female parts on another plant. In other words, we can actually call that plant a male or a female plant. And in that case, we speak of a dioecious plant. The second term that we can use to define the plant is whether it has a superior ovary or an inferior ovary. So the one that we've just done, we saw that the sepals and the petals were underneath the ovary, right? So the ovary was above the flower whorls, and therefore we say that plant has a superior ovary. If the ovary is below the other flower whorls, below the sepals and below the petals, then it is called an inferior ovary, right? And then lastly, pollination. You guys all know what pollination is. It's the movement of pollen from the male anther to the female stigma, okay? And when that happens, the pollen will be transferred to the female parts, and boom, that is sex. Okay, so you all know what pollination is, and you know that pollination is done by wind and insects. You'll have a self-study section on pollination, so you can read more about that later. Some plants are able to self-pollinate. So when a flower is monoecious, okay? It has male parts and female parts. Then the pollen from one flower pollinates that same flower, okay, or flowers from the same plant. That is self-pollination, right? So it's not one flower transferring pollen via, let's say, for example, a bee to another plant. That would just be pollination or cross-pollination. If it's happening on the same plant, it is self-pollination. Okay, there I have my cross-pollination. So different flower, different anther, pollinating different stigma. Okay, grade 11s, there's not much to say about this flower that you see here because we're not doing a practical exam this year, but what I will point out for you, and it has caught grade 11s by surprise every year, even though it's right here on this note. If we give you a flower like this, if you look nicely at the diagram, you'll see the ovule, you can see the style, you can see the stigma on the top, those red, these little red balls are the stigma, all right? This is the style. And then obviously the ovaries on the inside there. If you have a look at here, there's a whole bunch of filaments, little sticks with little balls on top. And so that would be a filament with an anther and a whole bunch of them. And a lot of grade 11s get confused by that because they're expecting two different structures. Okay, so I just want to point that out to you if it comes up in a test. Right, now the following diagrams, grade 11s, this is what I'm going to say before you even look at them, before I even explain them, before anything. I'm going to say this. Just like when we did the gymnosperms, diagrams are diagrams. A diagram like a flower needs explanation because I'm going to ask questions on it. A diagram like this one, you are required to just know the diagram and nothing further. All right, I don't, especially in this time of lockdown, I don't want to make your lives any more difficult than it needs to be. So I'm going to say this. There is a diagram. B, C, D, E, and F, you will not write in a test. You will write exene, intene, blah, 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 blah. You do not need to know what exene is and what intene is, but if you do want to know, exene is on the layer on the outside, intene is the layer on the inside. And that's as far as I'm going to go and say to you, if I ask you to draw it, and that is the end. I will not ask you anything more. All right. The only thing I can do to make this a little bit more difficult, so you'll see that the heading says pollen grain before pollination. Right? So if I had to ask you in a test to draw a diagram that shows the structure that is made by an anther, then I'm asking you to draw a pollen grain before pollination. Right? Because the anther makes pollen. It would be pollen grain before pollination because pollination only happens once the pollen grain has attached itself to a stigma. All right, so that's as hard as it can be, guys, and I don't want you to overthink that. All right, this one, I want you to just ignore that there are two diagrams. Please don't be confused by that. Sort of scratch this one out. This is when the pollen grain just starts to grow after pollination, and this is once it's basically completed, right? So we're going to draw this one in a test if we had to, right? And all I'm going to explain to you is if you looked at, and I'm not going to, oh, actually, let's go back. No. Okay, there we go. You can see in this diagram we have D, the tube nucleus, and F, the vegetative nucleus. Now, in this pollen grain, you should imagine that tube nucleus and vegetative nucleus, they need to get to the female, the ovule, to be able to fertilize, to make a new plant. So what's happening in the next structure is that pollen grain grows like a tail almost, called a pollen tube. Okay, so you can see this part here looks like a tail of the pollen grain that's developed, and that is called a pollen tube. The tube nucleus, D, is brought down via the pollen tube. Okay, and so the tube nucleus is going to travel to find the ovules within the ovary. The heading of this is pollen grain after pollination, and the hint is that it's grown a tail. So I could also make it as difficult as saying draw a diagram of the structure that an anther makes once it has attached itself to the stigma or the female reproductive part. Okay, that's as difficult as that can be. Right, then this diagram, so those two were males, these two are female parts. This diagram shows a cross-section of an ovary. Now, I want you to think of what a cross-section means, okay, before anything further. And then just think, this shows the inside of an ovary. And all that's important here, grade 11s, is to notice that the ovary has many ova, eggs, ovules within the ovary, okay? And again, we can just ask you to draw this. I'm not going further into that. This one shows a longitudinal section. So just for those of you who might not be with me, imagine imagine a stem. Just imagine a stem. Let's do it like that, okay? And imagine the stem is growing vertically up from the roots up towards the flower, okay? If I was going to cut that stem in cross section, it means somewhere between where the roots are and where the leaves are. I'm just going to slice that stem off, okay? So the stem will stay intact, but it'll be sort of split into two parts, into a top part and a bottom part. That's a cross section, okay? So that's what we just saw. What we are seeing in this diagram shows a longitudinal section. So now again, I want you to imagine that stem. I want you to think of a stick. And if I cut it sort of not between the roots and the leaves, but the actual stem, I take off and I cut that stem in half. So I cut along the stem. So I've got two halves of the stem. Okay, so each half would have roots and each half would have leaves. Right, so that's a longitudinal section. So that's what we're seeing here, is a longitudinal section of an ovary. And again, what's important now is to notice that there are many ovules within an ovary. Okay, and then we come to this intricate, my worst part of this whole section, but it is flower fertilization. And I'm going to say this, grade 11s, in my history of leading grade 11, I've never asked flower fertilization in depth, because flower fertilization is so much more intricate than the others. So when I'm talking about flower fertilization, perhaps I should just say rather alternation of generations, because you've done alternation of generations of a bryophyte. You've done alternation of generations of a pteridophyte. So now we need to talk about alternation of generations of angiosperms specifically. And it's very complicated, all right? And it's unnecessary for you to understand it so in depth. So the YouTube links that I've put here, from the top one over here, and then the other three, they can explain them to you, and you can find videos on the internet to explain them to you. But as a whole, I don't ask the detail of alternation of generations of a flower, because it is way too intricate compared to the rest. But you should just try and remember from alternation of generations that we're going to have an egg, we're going to have a sperm, right? The egg and sperm are going to fertilize. When they fertilize, it's going to form a zygote. The zygote is going to grow into a adult plant. And here the difference is that the adult plant does not make spores. It is going to make seeds. All right. That is what I want you to understand, is that angiosperms and gymnosperms make seeds. And even more than that, angiosperms make covered seeds, whereas gymnosperms make naked seeds. Right. For those of you, because this always happens, and I do know that I'm going to have some of you that are very happy for me to say I'm not going to do anymore, and I know that I'm going to have some of you that are asking lots of questions. and want to know, and if it was class, then some of you would be like, but ma'am, what about this and what about that? Grade 11s, I just need to say that this is a very tough time for us, for you guys, for everybody to try and navigate. And I'm not here to try and make your lives more difficult than they already are. So can I ask that you remember that I know more than you know at this point, and I'm not trying to play that teacher thing where they say, I know more and I got a degree, and that's not what I'm playing. I want to say, I set the exam at the end of the year. I also know what it is that you need to know in matric and what you do not need to know. Okay? And even for those of you who are thinking, but it's not about matric, it's about varsity, I also studied this in varsity, so I know what you need to know and what you don't need to know. And I know what they reteach if you do need to know it. So I want to say to you, I would rather not get into the details, the intimate, the intricacy of flower fertilization, so as to rather have your attention where it's important. So like on the structure of the flower, on the definitions, monoecious, dioecious, superior ovary, inferior ovary, on gynoecium and androecium, and the basics of alternation of generations if you watch these videos. But because I also know that every year I don't ask it, because it's not actually a CAPS important, essential topic to be discussed, I would rather, at this point, when I'm not face-to-face with you teaching you, not go into those details. Okay, sorry if that sucks for you, but please accept that. As it is, it means I can rather focus on what is important for you guys. Okay, then just to finish off this topic, I said earlier on that there would be some self-study. And this is it, pollination. There are 3 types. There is pollination through wind and through insects and through birds. And you are so clever because you all made it to grade 11. So you can all read this by yourselves. It does come up in one-word terms or questions, quick, small questions, not big questions. So it's just self-study. The reason for this is I don't want to read to you what you can read by yourself. I would rather explain to you what maybe is a little bit more difficult to understand or not as self-explanatory. This is. So happy reading, grade 11s. And the last one, significance of seeds. So why are seeds important? I would at this point, that is the last slide, so I would at this point just also like to say that you have textbooks, and I didn't think we'd be here, so I didn't bring my textbook home with me, so I can't guide you towards your textbook, but I would like to say that you have textbooks and you should read them and you should go over them, and the point would be that you work alongside my notes and my videos that I'm going to send you, and then also through your textbook to try and work through this. And then lastly, grade 11s, I'd like to say I'm going to be doing 1 or 2 more videos. So I'm definitely going to do animal diversity with you, and I'd like to maybe do some photosynthesis. They will come as and when this tired mommy has some time to make these videos. There will not be a deadline as such, but I will send you all messages on WhatsApp based on my, what I think your timeline that you should try to follow. And that's that. Good luck. I hope my voice hasn't irritated you, and I hope that you are surviving and staying sane.